Things to start with. First, Chap has put a poster up here. If you are not from a tradition that does this, it may not be familiar to you, but next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday is the beginning of the Lenten season for Christians, at least from traditions to celebrate or observe Lent. And if you've ever wondered why the whole Mardi Gras thing happens, what's up with Mardi Gras? Mardi Gras translates to Fat Tuesday, and it's Fat Tuesday because it's the day before Lent begins, and Lent is a period of fasting for Christians. We give up things during Lent, and so Mardi Gras was kind of this big party that was thrown right before this big fast began. So the beginning of Lent is Ash Wednesday, and it's a celebration, or not really celebration, a special service with an observance of a rite where ashes are drawn onto our foreheads in the shape of a cross. And the whole service revolves around a kind of a reminder of our mortality, that we don't live forever, that we are mortal and we will die. And that can sound kind of morbid, but part of the point is to refocus you on how precious life is, that you don't waste time, and that to give thanks to God for what He gives you here and now, and also to remind us that for Christians, this world is not our permanent home. There is another place, and we should prepare for the life to come with this life, rather than just living for here and now. All of that to say there will be Ash Wednesday services here on campus next Wednesday, and Chap does 3 services during the day. There's one at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then 11 o'clock in the morning, and then at 5 o'clock in the evening. And if you come to one of those services and you attend the service and you get the ashes, I'll give you extra credit. And so if you come to the Ash Wednesday services and you receive the ashes, I'll give you extra credit. And there'll be a sign-up sheet here that you can sign, or you can take a selfie of yourself with the ashes on your forehead and send it to me, and I'll give you credit for it. But you'll get extra credit. Next Wednesday, Wednesday, March 2nd. What's up? Yes, 7 in the morning, 11 in the morning, and then 5 in the evening. And if it's up here too, if you end up forgetting, and there's going to be flyers or posters around campus, other places too, if you forget. But it's next Wednesday, 7, 11, and 5. And yeah, send me a picture or hit the sign-up sheet that Chap will have, and I'll give you credit. Also, we are coming up on time for the next exam, and so we got this week, which ends today, and then next week, and we'll look at the life of David primarily next week, and then the week after that will be spring break, and then the week following that, on the Wednesday of the week following spring break, we'll have our second exam. So that'll be the 16th, I believe, Wednesday the 16th. Will be our second exam, and I'll get you a study guide either towards the end of next week or sometime during spring break, so that you've got several days at least to look at it before the exam. But look to that, be prepared for that, and make sure that you can be here in class on the 16th, so that you don't have to deal with the penalty for missing the exam or any of that stuff. All right. Any questions about Ash Wednesday or the upcoming exam? Why not? All right. Well, let's get into our lecture then. We were picking up where we left off in Judges, beginning of Judges chapter 6 with the story of Gideon. If you remember, we've seen, or we talked about on Wednesday, the theme, or one of the major themes in Judges, is this cycle of apostasy that we talked about, the cycle of apostasy, where the people of Israel they'll turn away from God and turn towards these idols and start worshiping these foreign idols because of the people surrounding them, and they'll worship these idols, and so God will allow them to be oppressed by some of these other people groups. God will take away protection and not bless them and protect them the way that He would if they were being faithful, and allow them to be oppressed by these other peoples. And eventually the people of Israel will get so fed up under this oppression, and they'll suffer so much from these other peoples, that they will cry out to God for help and deliverance. And so when they repent and they recognize their wrongdoing, and they turn back to God and cry out for help, God will send them a hero or a judge, and that judge will somehow, some way, it's different for each one, but somehow or another, they will rescue them from the oppression that they're under, and the people will be set free from that oppression. And generally, things continue to go well during the lifetime of that judge, but then when they die, the people of Israel forget, go back to worshiping idols, and the cycle begins again. And the thing about this cycle is that it doesn't just go around and around and around and stay the same, but every time that they go through this cycle, they get a little worse, and things get a little more corrupt and a little more twisted, until eventually by the end of the book, we're dealing with a whole bunch of situations that are just really messed up, as we'll see probably on Monday. I didn't get here with the other class to the last things on the list here, so maybe next week before we get to them. But God keeps sending them these judges that will rescue them when things go bad, and things go well for them during the lifetime of those judges, and then people turn away. And the last kind of judges that we saw on Wednesday was Deborah and Barak and Jael driving the tent peg through the head of the enemy general, and so all that story. And so today we are looking at Gideon, and so it's happened again. The Israelites have been set free from oppression, and things are good during the lifetime of Deborah, but then after she's gone, the people pretty quickly turn away from the worship of God and worship idols, and so God allows them to be oppressed again. And this time it's the Midianites, descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael. And the Midianites they would come in and they just like swarm over things like locusts. They bring in their flocks and their animals, and the animals just eat everything that they can find, eat all the vegetation and all the crops. And the Midianites come in and steal everything that they can find that's valuable or edible. And so the Israelites are in really bad shape with the Midianites coming in, and there's just huge numbers of them. In fact, the army that's going to be on the table towards the end of this story of Gideon's story, the army is going to be in the hundreds of thousands, at least probably a couple 100,000, because 125,000 or so die in the battle. And so there's hundreds of thousands of these Midianites that are plaguing Israel. And it's so bad, in fact, that when we first see Gideon is described as he's in a wine press threshing grain. And that detail doesn't make any sense unless you know what a wine press and what threshing is, and how weird it would be to do threshing in wine press. Wine press, the name kind of gives you a hint. It's this trough. They would build this trough or dig this trough out of stone, and then there would be an outlet to a lower trough, and you would place in the upper trough, you would place grapes, and then you would crush them somehow in the upper trough, and then the grape juice would run out into the lower trough, and then you would bottle that juice and it would ferment and become wine. And so this was how they were making wine. And you would either stomp on the grapes, or you would use some kind of a tool or something heavy to press and squish the grapes to get the juice out. And that's how you made wine. Well, the Israelites, they're in such bad situation. These wine presses were always built in the low part, down in valleys in between hills, because there's no reason to carry the grapes all the way up and then have to carry the juice all the way back down to put it on a hilltop. And so the Israelites are in such a bad place that they're threshing in this wine press, or Gideon is. And threshing is the process of separating the grain from the plant that the grain grows on. So if you've got a wheat crop, there's 3 steps to getting that grain, that wheat, to where you can use it to make flour and eat it. And the first step is to harvest it, which is to cut it out of the ground, to cut the plant off and get the plant separated from the ground. And then there is the threshing, which is where you separate the wheat kernels from the rest of the plant. And then there is winnowing, which is the process of separating out the unwanted stuff from the wheat kernel so that you just have the good stuff left. And so the way that they would do this in ancient Israel was they would cut off the stalk of the plant and bind it together into sheaves, and then they would carry those sheaves to a threshing floor, which was almost always built on a high hilltop and was kind of had a low wall surrounding it. And you would carry the wheat plants with the heads of grain into the threshing floor, and then you would use some kind of a tool or an implement to beat it. And the impact, the beating on it, would cause the heads of grain to pop open and the good grain to fall out, the kernels of grain to fall out. And then they would take a fork and winnow it and they would basically throw everything up into the air. And because they were on a hilltop, there would be a good cross breeze, and they would catch the lighter leftover stuff and carry that stuff away and blow it out of the threshing floor, and the heavier grain kernels would fall back down and stay in the threshing floor. And so that's what you do. You would harvest it, carry it to this place, you would thresh it to break open, break apart the wheat kernels from the heads, and then you would throw it up in the air and winnow it to separate it out and get the chaff, the leftover stuff, out of the threshing floor. A pretty key component, especially in that last step, is that cross breeze from being on top of a hill to make the job easier. And so it was a huge pain to do your threshing and winnowing in a wine press down in the valley where you had no wind. And so the fact that Gideon is down in this valley threshing in a wine press is a sign of how bad things are, and he's doing this specifically, the text says, to hide from the Midianites that he has any grain. Otherwise, the Midianites, if they see him threshing in the threshing floor, will note that he has a crop in and will come and steal it from him. And so Gideon is threshing in this wine press to hide it from the Midianites, when all of a sudden, God comes and speaks to him. The angel of the Lord comes and speaks to Gideon and tells him that he is a mighty warrior, and he is to lead the people of Israel against the Midianites to release them from captivity, to release them from their oppression. And Gideon immediately thinks to himself, I'm a nobody from a nobody tribe, from a totally uninfluential family in a tribe that nobody cares about. What do you mean I'm a great warrior and going to lead anybody? And so his reply is basically, who am I that I'm going to lead anybody? My family's not important. Why are you coming to me? And God tells him, anyway, you're going to do it. You're the mighty warrior, the one I've chose. You're going to lead the people of Israel. You're going to lead the armies against the Midianites and free the people. And Gideon is really nervous and not real sure about this, and so he asks for a sign. And so he goes in and gathers some stuff to make an offering to God, including some meat. And he boils this meat in some water and makes a broth out of it, and then he bakes some loaves of bread, flat loaves of bread, and brings those out. And the angel of the Lord tells him to place all of his offering on this stone and to pour the broth out over the top of it. And when he does that, and then the angel of the Lord takes this staff that he's holding and taps the rock, and all of a sudden fire shoots out of the rock and consumes the offering. And so now Gideon has his sign that this really is God talking to him. And so the angel of the Lord tells him to go and to break down the altar of Baal that has been built on the hilltop nearby on his father's land, to go and break down that altar to Baal and to cut down the Asherah pole next to it, which was Asherah was the consort of Baal that's very often associated with him, and to take to build an altar to the Lord in place of this altar of Baal, and to take the wood from the Asherah pole and use that to start a fire and to make a sacrifice on this altar to the Lord that he's going to build. Well, Gideon is nervous about doing this, and so he waits until the middle of the night and takes some of his most trusted workers with him, and goes up and they break down the altar to Baal. They use the pieces and make an altar to God, and they cut down the Asherah pole, cut it into pieces, and use that to start a fire, and they offer a bull on this altar. They sacrifice a bull on the altar, and then they leave. And the next morning, people wake up and they find the altar to Baal smashed and another altar in its place, and the Asherah pole cut down and the wood burnt, and an animal being sacrificed on this altar. And they are afraid and angry that somebody has desecrated this altar to Baal, and they're afraid Baal is going to get mad at them, and so they want to find the person who killed them. And they figure out that it is Gideon, and they determine to go and kill him, and so they go to his father's house and they tell the father to bring him out, and the father says basically, if Baal is really God, then let Baal deal with Gideon. If he's not really God, then you don't have to worry about it. And so if Baal wants to contend with Gideon, let Baal contend with Gideon. And so they end up giving Gideon this nickname. His nickname is Jerubbaal, which translates to he contends with Baal. So basically he's the thorn in Baal's side. And so Gideon does this thing that he's supposed to do, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. It's only the first thing that he's supposed to do. The long-term goal, the thing that he's supposed to do, is to lead the armies of Israel against the Midianites. And so he puts out the call to arms for the people of Israel and the people of his tribe especially to come and to gather to get ready to fight against the Midianites at the Lord's command. But while the people are gathering, he's still really nervous about all this. And while all of these armies are gathering, he goes to God and says, look, I really, really want to be sure that this is you talking, so can you give me another sign? And says, here's my sign, here's what I want you to do. I have this fleece, this bundle of wool cut from an animal, from a lamb or sheep. And it says, I'm going to leave the fleece outside overnight, and when I wake up in the morning, let the fleece be soaked with water and the ground around it dry. And then I'll know that it's you talking to me and you're really sending me. And so he goes to bed, he gets up the next morning, goes out, sure enough, the fleece is soaking and the ground around it is dry. So wet, in fact, the fleece is so wet that he picks it up and wrings it out, and there's a whole bowl full of water that comes out of it. But he's still not sure, still not convinced, and so he says, one more time, God, just please, one more, do it the other way this time. In the morning, let me find the fleece dry and the ground around it wet. And so he goes to bed, he gets up the next morning, and sure enough, the fleece is bone dry and all the ground around it is covered in dew, soaking wet. And so finally he says, okay, I'll go. And all these men have gathered, and he ends up with about 33,000 Israelites ready to fight against an army of well over 100,000, maybe more like 200,000 plus. I was a ministry major, so I didn't take a lot of math classes, but this doesn't sound like a great idea to me. 33,000 against somewhere around 200,000, maybe more. But that's what he's got. But God isn't done, and I think that there is a level of, because of Gideon's constant testing of God and the demanding sign after sign after sign, first the flame on the altar, and then the wet fleece, and then the dry fleece. He's demanded a sign from God 3 times before he'll go and lead this army. And so now God is kind of responding by giving him 3 kind of extra tests of faithfulness and commitment. And so he has this army of 33,000 to go against hundreds of thousands. And then God tells him, really that's too many. If 33,000 fight against these Midianites, the Israelites might come to think, or might believe, that it's because of their great strength that they have won, and not because I have given them the victory. And so he says, tell the fighting men, that any of them that are afraid and want to go home can leave. And so Gideon tells all the fighting men, any of you that are afraid and want to go home, you can go. You don't have to come and fight. And so 23,000 of them beg off, go home. And so now his 33,000 is 10,000. And God says, no, that's still too many. I'll tell you what to do. Go down to the river, and when you get to the river, I'll show you which men you're to take into battle and which ones you're to send home. And so when they get to the river, all the men go down to get a drink. And so they get down, and some of them get down, or most of them get down on their knees and drink really close to the water, so they don't get covered in water, or they don't, whatever. So they go down on their knees and drink from the water at the shore. But there's a few that instead of getting down and on their knees and drinking from the water, they stay either standing up as near as they can, or they squat down and they don't go down on their knees, and they cup water in their hands and then they lap it from their hands like dogs. That's a really weird way to drink water, right? And there's been some kind of suggestions over time. Some people suggested that the reason that they did that, these men, was that they could keep their eyes up and look for the enemy while they were drinking. It's plausible, but it's not really clear in the text that that's why they did it. It was just a really weird way to drink water, as far as the text is concerned. And it's weird enough, in fact, that only 300 out of the 10,000 do it that way. Everybody else goes down on their knees to get closer to the water to get a drink. And so it's only these 300 that lap from their hands like dogs. And so God says, those are your men. And so now Gideon's army of 33,000 first pared down to 10,000. They send those other 9,700 home, and now he's got 300 to go against 200,000 or so. This is feeling and sounding a lot like the Battle of Jericho, the whole march around the city 7 times and blow the trumpets and it will fall. And an absolutely insane battle plan. But this is what God tells Gideon to do. And Gideon does it. He goes and takes his 300, and they take the trumpets and the torches and the provisions of the 10,000 left, or the 9,700 that left, they take all those provisions and all that stuff and go with them and go down to where the army is encamped, the Midianites are encamped. And before they, as they're getting close, God tells Gideon what he's supposed to do and how he's supposed to lead this group against the Midianites. And it's obvious that Gideon is still kind of nervous about this whole thing, which you would be with 300 against over 100, 200,000 or so. And so God tells him, if you are still worried about going into battle, you and your servant go down to the Midianite camp tonight under the darkness, sneak down to the Midianite camp and listen to what they have to say. And so he and his servant go down and sneak down to the camp in the middle of the night, and when they get close enough to hear, they hear these two watchmen talking about one of them having a dream. And the one that has a dream is describing it to the other, and so he says that in his dream, he saw this loaf of barley bread come flying or tumbling into the Midianite camp, and it strikes a tent with such force that it knocks the tent over. And the other guy that's listening to this dream interprets it and says, oh, that's the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And it must mean that the Lord has given the Midianites into Gideon's hand, and basically we're all going to die. Just discuss it casually, that we're all going to die. But when Gideon hears these Midianites, that they have been given this dream and hears the interpretation, now he's encouraged and emboldened. And so he goes back to his men, and the next night they plan their attack. And the plan of attack is, normally in an army, you would have a small troop, for example. You'd have a few dozen men, and you would have maybe one guy in that few dozen men that has a horn to blow to signal to the commander, or to receive, to send back messages, or to just encourage the men. So you'd have one man and a few dozen that would have a horn. And you might have another one or two in that few dozen that would carry a torch. And then everybody else would have their hands free so that they could have their hands on weapons to fight with. But Gideon and his men have taken all of the supplies from all of the 10,000, and so now every man in Gideon's troop has a horn and a torch, and so both their hands are full. But God has told them that here's your attack plan. You're going to split into 3 groups of 100 each and go to different places around the Midianite camp and surround them. And you will light your torches and put a pot over the torch. And then at Gideon's signal, you will take the pot off of the torch and smash it on the ground. Shout, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon! For the sword of the Lord and of Gideon!" And blow the trumpets. And so they do this, they go out, they surround the army, and at Gideon's signal, they take and pull the pot off of their torches. Suddenly the torches are blazing and bright with light, and they smash the pots down on the ground and make this huge, enormous noise and start shouting for the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, and then they blow the trumpets. And to the Midianites, hundreds of thousands though they are, they look around and they suddenly see all of these torches, which normally you have just a few to several dozen men, and so they assume that there's a large number of them. And they hear all these trumpets, which again, normally you have just one to several dozen men, and so they think it's a much bigger force than it is. And they hear all of this shouting and this racket, the cracking and breaking of stuff, and they think that they're already under attack. And so the Midianite army panics. And they start grabbing weapons, and they start turning around and trying to flee, and there are people in their way, and so they start attacking, and they end up fighting against each other. They end up attacking each other in their panic. And so the Midianite army starts to kill itself. Eventually, enough of them start to, they just retreat. They start running. They stop killing each other so much, and they start running. And so Gideon and his army chase after them. And as they're chasing after them, they pick up fighters from other cities and tribes along the way. They see people running, the Midianites running, and so they want to join in the battle now. And so they go after them, and all over the course of that next day, they keep chasing them down and killing more and more and more of the Midianites, until eventually they're able to capture and kill all of the kings of the Midianites that were in that big camp and drive off all of the remaining Midianites and their soldiers. And so they win this great big victory, and the Midianites are gone. They're no longer a problem for Israel. And in response, many of the Israelites go to Gideon, and they want to make him their ruler. They want him to rule over them, as the judges have done in the past. And usually the judges will win this great victory for Israel, and then the Israelites will follow them and do what they say until they die, and then the Israelites go off the deep end. But Gideon doesn't want to rule over them. He doesn't want to be king, or he doesn't want to be a ruler. He wants to go back to whatever peaceful life he can have. And so he doesn't want that responsibility, and so he declines. But he does say, instead, I don't want to be a ruler, but I do have one request. Each of you, give me one earring from among your spoils. And the Midianites had the tradition or the habit of wearing a gold earring in one ear. And so as the Israelites are killing all of these Midianite soldiers, they're all taking the gold earrings from the ears of the ones that they kill as their spoils and their winnings from the battle. And so Gideon says, each of you give me one of those earrings, and I'll be content. And so they spread out this cloak on the ground, and the whole Israelite army goes by and perfectly happy to give one of those earrings of the many they captured that day, to give one to Gideon for his spoils. And then Gideon had also, because he was the commander of this army, when the kings were killed, he takes their gold and the wealth that they were carrying as his spoils. And so Gideon walks away from this battle with quite a bit of gold, quite a bit of wealth. And instead of ruling over the people, he goes back to his hometown, and he does something kind of strange. He takes most of that gold, or most of the stuff that he got, most of his winnings for that day, and most of his spoils, and he makes an ephod out of it. And you don't have to know what an ephod is, but to explain what happens next, I'm not going to expect you to know it for tests, but you need to know for the context to understand what's happening here. The ephod is the outermost garment of the priest's clothing. God gives very specific instructions in Leviticus and some later some earlier in Exodus, some in Leviticus, and some in Deuteronomy, for what the priests are supposed to wear when they serve in the tabernacle and later in the temple. And one of the most important pieces of that, or parts of that, is this outer garment called the ephod. And there's one particular ephod made for the high priest. All the other priests have one that's made out of cloth, but the high priest has one that's made out of gold and precious stones. And there's this breastplate of precious stones, or there's 12 stones, 12 big stones, various different kinds of precious stones, arranged in three columns and 4 rows, and each of the 12 stones represents one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then there's these two things or stones up on the shoulders called the Ummim and the Thummim, and they have the 12 tribes of Israel carved on them. The names of the 12 tribes of Israel carved on them, and this Ummim and Thummim were used as almost like divination, or like rolling dice to see what God's plan or intentions for them are. And so basically, if they do use the Ummim and Thummim and ask a question, God will determine the outcome and give them an answer through these two stones. And so they use that a lot, and even into David's time, we'll see they continue to use it. But this ephod, because it was the outermost garment that the priest wore, it was very symbolic. They saw it when they went to worship, and so it got this kind of symbolic importance. And so when they saw the ephod, they thought worship. And so it had this symbolic importance. And so Gideon makes an ephod out of this gold and puts it in amongst his family's treasury, his family's goods. And slowly, or over time, he and his family end up bowing and worshiping at this ephod like it was an idol. And then eventually it's not only him and his family, but lots of the people around him. Many people in Israel are bowing to this ephod of Gideon and worshiping it. And so even during the lifetime of Gideon, before this point, the judges, during their lifetime at least, things went well. But now with Gideon, even during his lifetime, things are starting to go sideways. The corruption in Israel is getting worse. And in fact, Gideon also takes several wives and a servant that he sleeps with, a concubine, and he ends up having 70 sons with his wives, and then 1 son with his concubine. And there ends up being this, in the next generation, this city takes the son that is by the illegitimate wife, or the concubine, and sets him up as ruler, and he kills off all of the half-brothers, all of the other sons of Gideon, the 70 sons of Gideon, he kills in the city. And then they make him king over them in this city, and he reigns for 3 years. But then some in the city turn against him, and he ends up wiping out the population of one town entirely. And the other city that's allied with it, he tries to kill all of them, but as he's going to set on fire the buildings that all the people are hidden in, a woman rolls a millstone out of the window and it hits him in the head, and he dies. Actually, he asks his servant to run him through with the sword before he dies, so that no one will be able to say that a woman killed him, because that would just be embarrassing for this warrior, right? And so this servant kills him before he dies from his head wound, from having his skull cracked by this millstone, and he dies. And so Gideon's family is haywire, and he was a judge. And so we see this worsening corruption already. Well, after Gideon, we get Jephthah. And Jephthah is another guy that he is the illegitimate son of the leader of a city, and his brothers send him away. His family sends him away because they don't want this illegitimate son to have a part in the inheritance. And so he goes out and ends up forming this basically band of brigands, and they live in the hills and they rob people on the roads, and that's how they live. And eventually, as Israel is again being oppressed, the people of his city come to him and ask him to lead their army against the oppressors. And he says, "You drove me out, and now you want me back to lead your army?" And they say yes, basically because he has the most combat experience, because he's been leading this band of brigands to attack people on the highways. And so they bring him in, and the agreement is that if he leads their army and they're victorious, then he can remain in the city and be leader over the whole city. And he can lead all the people. And so he agrees, and he goes to battle, and on his way out to battle, he makes a very foolish promise or vow to God. He vows that if God will give him the victory over this army that he's going out to fight against, these oppressors, then the first thing that comes out of his house when he returns home, he will offer as a sacrifice to God. And then he goes and he fights, and he wins the battle, and he goes home, and everybody's in a great mood celebrating. They've just had this great victory. And Jephthah's daughter comes out of the house with a tambourine in hand, shaking it, dancing to celebrate her father's victory, and she's the first out of the gate. And so Jephthah has made this vow to God that he will sacrifice the first thing out of his house, out of his gate, to come and greet him on the way back. And what is it but his only child? And he has no other children, only his daughter, and she comes out to celebrate with him. And so now Jephthah is, does he keep the vow to God or not? Does he sacrifice or offer his daughter or not? And he decides that he must keep the vow. And so he goes and he tells his daughter what's happened, that he made this vow, and she's the first thing out of the gates. And so now he has to offer her. And the daughter agrees with him that he must keep the vow, that she asks for 2 months to go and to travel in the hills with her friends and to mourn and weep that she will never be married. And so he agrees, and her and her friends spend 2 months wandering the hills. They're out in the hills, mourning that she is to be offered to God and will never get married, and then comes back and he carries out his vow. Now there is some ambiguity in the translation. It's usually normally it would be translated as a burnt offering, that he is promising or vowing to offer something as a burnt offering, whatever comes out of the gate first. But it's also a possible translation that it would be totally dedicated to God, because burnt offering and totally dedicated they're very similar terms in Hebrew. And so it's not real clear which of the two he meant. If it is burnt offering, then what he was promising to do was to kill, cut up, and burn whatever it is that came out of his gate first. And then that turns out to be his daughter, and he does that. If it's totally dedicated, it could be that in the case of his daughter, instead of being killed as a sacrifice, she would be fully dedicated or offered to God, and so she would go and live in the tabernacle as a kind of servant to the Levites, and she could never get married. And so that was, not sure which of those two it is, but either way, Jephthah's family line is over, because she's his only child, and she can't have children because she can't get married. And so, one is obviously more awful than the other if she's totally sacrificed, but it's not clear which of the two it was. What is clear, or what is very important to note, though, is that one, God never asked Jephthah to make that vow. That was never anything that God told him to do. Two, that God had already determined to give him the victory even before he made that vow, and so it had nothing to do, wasn't conditional or a part of him winning the battle. And this was just Jephthah. Jephthah did a foolish thing, made a foolish vow, and then instead of wisely going and asking God what to do about it or how he should respond, he just carries out his foolish vow. It was nothing of God asking for that sacrifice. But Jephthah also, after making this foolish vow and it having its consequences, Jephthah also has to deal with a group of other Israelites that are upset with him, angry because they say that he did not call them out to battle when he went to fight this group, and they wanted to be able to take part in winning this victory against their oppressors. But Jephthah says that he did in fact invite them and call them out to battle, and they didn't come. And so the argument or this conflict escalates until Jephthah and his men they have control over this important river crossing, this important place where the Ephraimites, the others that he's in conflict with, where they have to cross to go home. And he determines that the Ephraimites have so wronged him that he's just going to kill all of them that he can. And so any that are passing through his lands or crossing this river at this place where he controls it, the only way for these Ephraimites to get home, anybody that tries to cross there that's Ephraimite, they're going to die. And so he tells his men to ask everybody that comes through, anybody that is trying to cross this river, ask them to say the word Shibboleth. And so they asked them to say the word Shibboleth, and it was just kind of an odd thing with the Ephraimites. They had this particular accent that made it so that they didn't pronounce the SH sound correctly, and it came out as a hissing S sound. And so it was, instead of saying Shibboleth, they would end up saying Sibboleth. And his order was to just kill anybody that said Sibboleth instead of Shibboleth. And so they end up killing tens of thousands of the Ephraimites as they try to cross the river at this point. And this is the judge, and he is massacring fellow Israelites because of perceived slight. Things have gone real sideways. But we have one more major judge to go. There are a couple of lesser known judges in this between Jephthah and Samson, but I'm not having you remember all of them. But Samson is the last of the major judges that we see in the book of Judges. And Samson, his story actually begins with God coming and speaking to his mother and telling his mother that she's going to have a child and that he should be raised and should live under a Nazirite vow. And the Nazirite vow was supposed to be a short-term vow. You would take the Nazirite vow and you would live under it for a period of months or years, depending on the vow you took. And the Nazirite was not to cut their hair or to drink any kind of strong drink, any kind of alcohol, and they were to fulfill whatever their promise to God was, whatever duty God gave to them. And the whole point, the whole thing was to be totally dedicated to God for the period of this Nazirite vow. And so God tells this woman that she's going to have a son, and he is to live under a Nazirite vow from birth. So all the days of his life he is to live under this Nazirite vow. And so that means no razor should ever touch his head, and he should avoid strong drink. He does not avoid strong drink. Samson drinks fairly frequently, but he does keep the whole never cut his hair thing. No razor ever touches his head. And by the end of the story, in fact, we see that he has 7 braids that he keeps his hair pulled back in. And so, Samson is born, sure, and his parents keep the Nazirite vow or have him live under a Nazirite vow. His hair is never cut, and he doesn't drink until he's old enough and does it himself. And so Samson grows up, and as an adult, one day, he is traveling around, and by this point, the Israelites have been under the oppression of the Philistines. And unlike with the Midianites, who were coming in and raiding and then leaving, and they would just come in these massive swarms and take everything and leave, the Philistines were just occupying Israel. They lived there, and they were like slave drivers. They were overseers, and they lived there, and they made the Israelites serve them. And so the Philistines were living in the land, and Samson is going along one day, and he sees this young Philistine woman, and he reacts to her. He falls for her, and he wants her. And so he goes back to his dad, to his father, and says, "Get me this Philistine woman for my wife. Arrange this marriage, or arrange a wedding between me and this Philistine woman." His father's like, is there no one in Israel you could marry? There are no young women in Israel that are worth your time? But Samson says, no, I want her. And so the father goes and works it out, arranges that marriage. And when Samson comes to marry her, they give him this group of 30 men. The Philistines assign this group of 30 men to be his companions. Probably intended to be like hecklers and guards to make sure that he doesn't do anything, because the Philistines really didn't trust and didn't like these Israelites that they were lording over. But he is going to, there's a week-long celebration for this wedding, and he is going to marry this woman. And it turns out Samson has a bit of a poetic streak. He has a really bad problem with women, as we'll see, and he has a bit of a poetic streak. And so he offers as a kind of a challenge and a bet to these 30 companions that he's going to tell them a riddle, and if they can solve it by the end of the bridal week, the seven days of the wedding festivities, he will give them each a change of clothing, an expensive change of clothing, and if they fail, then they each have to give him one. So he'll give them 30 sets of clothing if they get it, and they have to give him 30 sets of clothing if they don't. And so he tells them, they agree, and he tells them the riddle, and it revolves around this moment where Samson was walking along one day, and a lion attacked him, and he killed the lion with his bare hands, ripped the corpse, or ripped the lion's body open, and left it there. And then later, as he was coming back through, weeks or months later, the corpse had decayed, and a hive of bees had taken up inside the body. And he went and pulled out some of that honeycomb and ate it as he was going home. And so his riddle, the riddle that he tells them is, out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something to sweet. And he hasn't told anybody else about the thing with the lion. Even his parents don't know. And so these 30 men keep trying to solve the riddle and keep trying to figure out what story it's about so they can give an answer. And around day 4, they go to his wife-to-be and threaten her and say, we'll kill your whole family if you don't get the answer from Samson, because this is embarrassing. He's come here to ridicule us. If you don't get the answer from him by the end of the week, we'll kill you and your whole family. And so the wife-to-be, the wife starts begging him to give her the answer, and he refuses until the very last day. And on the last day, he tells her what happened, tells her the story and the answer to the riddle. And then the young men, this group of 30 men comes right before sundown, before the end of the day, and gives him the answer. And his reply is, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. And so he calls his young wife a cow. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. So again, it's his poetry. And so he goes to the next town over, murders 30 Philistines, and strips them of their clothing, and comes back with the clothing of the 30 murdered Philistines, and gives that as his satisfaction of the bet, and leaves. And so he leaves without his new wife, and so the father gives her to one of his companions to be a wife. Well, weeks or months later, Samson comes back and wants to go in and see his wife and sleep with her, and the father won't let him in because he's given her to somebody else to be married to. And so Samson, in anger, goes and releases a whole bunch of foxes with torches tied to their tails into the Philistines' fields, and the foxes, trying to get away from the torches, run and drag the torches through the fields and set all their crops on fire. And so the Philistines are angry. They go and first they kill Samson's wife's family, burn the house down, kill her whole family, and then they go to the tribe of Judah and demand that they hand Samson over to them. Well, they go and they get Samson. Samson says, okay, if you won't kill me, I'll come with you. And they tie up his hands and bring him to the Philistines. And when he sees the Philistine army, when they're coming to the Philistine camp, he breaks the ropes on his arms, finds a nearby donkey's jawbone from a decayed donkey corpse, so the bone from the jaw of a donkey, and goes and uses that as a weapon against these Philistines and kills 1,000 of them. And then he writes a poem about it and says, with a donkey's or an ass's jawbone, I have made asses of them. With an ass's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men. Isn't it great how the translation even works out to rhyme in English? So he goes and kills these 1,000 men and then writes a song about it. Well, he continues to have problems with women, and he has, there's a particular prostitute that he falls for and goes and sleeps with her, and the Philistines find out he's in the town while he's there, and so they make a plan to kill him. But in the middle of the night, he goes to leave because apparently he knows the Philistines are coming, and he gets to the city gate, and the city gate is closed, and so he just grabs a hold of the city gate, jerks it out of its hinges, out of the wall, and carries this massive gate, this massive doorway into the city, and carries it to the nearby hill and lays it down, and then keeps on going about his way. And there keeps being other situations, other circumstances where he just, because he's angry or because he's jealous or because there's a woman involved, he kills Philistines, huge numbers of them, until eventually he falls in love with this woman named Delilah. She's also a prostitute, and he ends up living with her for several months. And during this time, she keeps asking him for the secret of his strength, because the Philistines have come to Delilah and offered her a huge amount of money if she can figure out the secret of his strength and arrange for him to be captured or killed. And so she sweetly asks him, what is the secret of your strength? Where does your strength come from? And how could someone take your strength away? And what would it take to make you like any other man? And so Samson makes up a lie and says that if I'm tied up with fresh bowstrings, I'll be as weak as any other man. So Delilah gets a bunch of fresh bowstrings and arranges with the Philistines to be in her house and hidden. And so when Samson goes to sleep that night, she ties him up with a bunch of fresh bowstrings. And then she shouts, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he wakes up and he breaks the bowstrings and he kills all the Philistines. Well, I would be a little suspicious at this point, but Samson doesn't seem to be suspicious. Instead, Delilah is angry that Samson lied to her and is now chiding him for not really loving her and not really caring for her because he won't tell her the truth. And so, tell me the truth. Where does your strength come from? How can you be made weak like any other man? And so he makes up another lie and says, this time if I'm tied up with 7 fresh cords, brand new ropes, if I'm tied up with brand new ropes, I'll become as weak as any other man. And so he finds himself in the middle of the night one night, tied up by brand new ropes, and he's asleep, and Delilah shouts out, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he wakes up, snaps the ropes, kills all the Philistines. And Delilah is once again angry that he has lied to her. And Samson doesn't seem to have gotten the clue yet that anything he tells Delilah is going to make him weak happens to him. And so Samson makes up probably the most ridiculous story ever about how to make him weak. And he says that if you take the 7 braids of my hair and you weave them into a loom and basically weave my hair into a carpet. And a loom was, a big wooden device used to weave and make cloth. So if you weave my hair into this big wooden device to like you're making a carpet or a cloth out of it, I'll become as weak as any other man. And so he finds himself in the middle of the night. He said, Delilah, after he's asleep, gets out the loom and arranges it and weaves his hair into this loom. And he wakes up when Delilah shouts, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he breaks the loom and takes the pieces of the loom and kills the Philistines in the room. And instead of getting the hint and this is a ridiculous story and it has just happened to him. And even so, he wakes up and kills the Philistines, and Delilah is angry that he has now lied to him 3 times. And she keeps badgering him until eventually he gives in and tells her the truth. I was born under a Nazirite vow. My hair has never been cut. My head's never been touched by a razor. If my head is shaved, then I'll become as weak as any other man. And the story says that Delilah gets him to sleep with his head in her lap, and then calls in someone to shave his head, and then shouts, Philistines are upon you. And Samson thinks everything's okay. He'll fight back like usual, but he doesn't realize that his hair's been cut. And so he tries to fight back, but instead he's captured. And the Philistines actually pluck out his eyes and blind him, and then put him to work grinding grain in a mill, pushing the millstone around and around and around. And they bring him into the temple of Dagon when they're having a celebration to try to show off how strong they are, how great their God is, that they have humbled even this great warrior, Samson. And while he's there, after he has been made to perform for them and embarrassed as much as they could, he asked to be put against the support pillars for the temple. And while he's there, his hair has regrown as he's been in captivity. While he's there, he prays and asks God to give him strength one last time to take revenge on his enemies that have blinded him. And he pushes on these pillars, the support pillars, pushes on 2 of them, and collapses the whole temple. And thousands of Philistines are in the temple, including their king and their leaders and their priests and some of their most influential people in this great temple. They all die along with Samson. And so Samson judges Israel and rescues them. And one of the things to notice about Samson's story is that he doesn't do this because he believes in God. Every time that he kills Philistines, it's for his own selfish motives, because he's angry, because he wants revenge, because he's got it for some girl, because he's been blinded and he wants to get them back. He's not a good man. He doesn't do it for the right reasons, and yet God uses him anyway to free the Israelites. We'll have to stop there, and we'll get to the last stories, chapter 17 and on, I believe, on Monday, and then start the story of David. Make sure you hit the sign-up sheet if you hadn't on the way in.